I'd like to welcome everybody. This is the Hofstra Cultural Center's reading and discussion of Lee Zimmerman's book, Trauma and the Discourse of Climate Change. There will be approximately a 30-minute reading by Professor Zimmerman, followed by a response by Professor James Berger, who will then lead a Q&A session following that. Just a couple of quick notes. Please, during the reading, please do keep your mics muted, and then you can certainly open them up when we get to the Q&A, and we'll have some more specific instructions at that point. Please also, if you could switch to speaker view as well during the talk, and that way you can focus a little bit more than having to stare at hundreds of faces. A couple of quick intros for our guest tonight. First, Professor James Berger. He taught in the English department at Hofstra from 1996 to 2007. Since then, he has been a senior lecturer in American Studies and English at Yale. He's the author of 2 scholarly books, After the End, Representations of Post-Apocalypse, and The Disarticulate, Language, Disability, and the Narratives of Modernity, as well as 2 books of poetry. And he is the conduit and midwife to the OBU Manifestos, Volumes 1 and 2. He teaches courses on disability studies, utopias, dystopias, and apocalypses, animal studies, the historical novel, and the future of the humanities. Our featured speaker for this evening, of course, is Professor Lee Zimmerman, who came to Hofstra last century from UCLA, where he got his PhD. He is professor of English at Hofstra and is the editor of the journal 20th Century Literature. In addition to Trauma and the Discourse of Climate Change, he is the author of Intricate and Simple Things, the Poetry of Galway Kinnell, and has written widely on modern poetry, literature and psychoanalysis, trauma, and a range of related topics. He teaches courses in 20th and 21st century American literature, British Romanticism, literature and trauma, literature and neoliberalism, and of course, literature and the climate crisis. Without further hesitation, I will hand over the Zoom to Professor Zimmerman.
Okay, wow. Thanks a lot, Adam. And thanks everyone for being here. Very exciting for me. I'm going to try to talk about different sections of the book. I'm going to skip over the literature stuff and try to catch some of the other chapters. Maybe we can talk about literature afterwards if we want. I've tried to rewrite some of what I'm going to be reading to make it hopefully more appropriate to be spoken rather than read. We'll see if that works. Okay, so this goes about 30, might go a touch over 30, we'll see. But anyway, thanks for hanging in there. Okay, so in the book, I try to argue that the ways we write and talk about the climate crisis contribute to a form of unrecognized and normalized denial. And I argue that we might understand this pervasive species of denial by thinking of climate change as a kind of trauma. In arguing this, I take as a premise that anthropogenic global warming represents an existential threat. This is not a threat to the planet or to Earth, which will presumably exist in some form for another 5 billion years or so, but rather it's a threat to the current climate system. This climate system is a condition of possibility for the countless life forms by which the planet is now inhabited, including what is often called human civilization. Of course, climate change isn't just a threat. It's already contributed to massive loss of life. And because the carbon we emit into the atmosphere, mainly by burning fossil fuels, stays in the atmosphere for a long time, we've already guaranteed massive loss of life in the future. But calling the climate crisis a threat reflects a second premise. There's still a chance to prevent our reaching a tipping point, a degree of warming that might trigger an unstoppable collapse of the current climate system. That system, sometimes called the Holocene, is only about 10,000 years old. It has allowed for the development of civilization, but without drastic reductions of greenhouse gas emissions over the next few years, there's a real risk that the stable climate system in which humans have thrived for those 10,000 years will undergo not merely a linear, gradual, reversible change, but rather a relatively swift, irreversible, radical collapse into a different system altogether, sometimes called hothouse Earth, a system much less amenable to human life, to put it mildly. Timothy Morton suggests that discovering global warming is like realizing for some time you have been conducting your business in an expanding sphere of a slow motion nuclear bomb. Though we should add, it might still be possible to arrest that expanding sphere before the full force of the bomb is unleashed. In that sense, Eugene Linden seems closer to the mark when he asks about global warming. Will we continue to squeeze the trigger on the gun we have put to our own head? So even that figuration obscures the fact that we're squeezing the trigger harder and harder, that, astonishingly, the more we know about the crisis, the closer we get to that point of no return, the faster we emit greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. But my main point here is that even in the process of pulling the trigger, in the process of pulling it faster and faster, we might yet be able to stop before the bullet is discharged. In 2012, at a conference for geologists, Brad Warner delivered a paper with a slightly non-technical main title, "Is Earth Fucked?" His short answer was, more or less. That uncertainty informs my starting point. It might be possible to prevent global warming from reaching a likely tipping point where less fucked turns into more fucked. My third premise is that because the window for doing this is rapidly closing, it would mean a radical disruption in cultural and economic business as usual. In 2013, the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research observed that we either continue with rising emission and reap the radical repercussions of severe climate change in the future, or we acknowledge that we have a choice and pursue radical emissions reductions now. And thus it concluded, no longer is there a non-radical option. Either we do nothing and there's a radical future, or we take radical action now. In the book, I try to elaborate on how the ways we talk and write about climate change, what I call the discourse of climate change, how those ways represent, for the most part, a failure to recognize business as usual as itself committed to a horrifically radical future. And I suggest that with that failure, the present is committing an act of atrocity on that future. Another way of putting the point is this. If the goal is to stop short of the likely point of no return, to curtail that atrocity, then the incrementalism that structures our current institutional responses to the crisis is beside the point. Incrementalism is often justified with a logic conveniently abstracted from any historical, scientific, or social context. You've heard this. We must not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. What the particular context of the climate crisis presents us with is a logic of a less convenient sort. We must not let what is comfortably called the good be the enemy of the sufficient. So the introduction of the book establishes and elaborates those three premises. You'll notice that in doing that, I've been referring to what we must do, or how we talk and write. I use that pronoun for stylistic expediency, but it's important to acknowledge that in doing this, I'm glossing over a crucial geopolitical dynamic. The crisis has been mainly and knowingly produced by the rich countries in the global north, while it is those in the global south who have suffered the most disastrous consequences. Speaking of what we have done, thus obscures that, in fact, the planet is a crime scene. Indeed, the scene of a crime in process. Of course, to write, it is hard to write and speak about climate without resorting to we. And that particular rhetorical problem points to a more pervasive question, which is the focal point of my first chapter. How can we speak or write about the climate crisis in a way that doesn't merely reproduce rhetorical business as usual? How can we speak or write in a way that doesn't minimize or normalize climate as a political issue or a societal problem, as opposed to an existential threat to those very political and societal systems in the first place? This is the problem presented by trauma itself. If we think of trauma as a happening that seems to exceed any attempt to know it or represent it in language, a happening that cannot yet be processed, then how can we write or talk about trauma at all without reducing it to something already known, already processed? How can we talk about a trauma in normal language without normalizing it and thus vitiating its threat? In cultural trauma studies, this problem emerged first in relation to the problem of how to represent the Holocaust. Many of you will be familiar with Art Spiegelman's Mouse. It's a text that grapples with this very representational problem. In it, at one point, a Holocaust survivor, Pavel, seems to throw up his hands. Look at how many books have already been written about the Holocaust. What's the point? People haven't changed. Maybe they need a newer, bigger Holocaust. And we can hear a similar lament in the words of climate scientist James Hansen in his book, Storms of My Grandchildren. When Hansen first comes to realize the extremity of what global warming means, he first wonders, how in the world can a situation like this be communicated credibly? He tries. As a leading scientist at NASA, he has many meetings with government officials in which he tried to explain the science as well as I could, he says. But these meetings were futile. And afterward, he is left up against the discursive limits of science. He's left still wondering, how is it possible to portray the horror of that devastation in a way beyond graphs and numbers and phrases we have heard before, like climate disaster? One of the crucial difficulties in trying to speak outside of the dominant discourses, in trying to speak outside of what we have heard before, is illustrated by a scene described by Rebecca Solnit. A group of climate activists tried to urge the board of the San Francisco Employees Retirement System to divest from fossil fuel stocks. Solnit writes that it was as though the people in that room were having different conversations in different languages in different worlds. And versions of that schizophrenic conversation are being had all over this continent and in Europe. In Solnit's terms, these different worlds are grounded in different logics of rationality. Where the retirement board talked interminably about how wild and reckless it would be to divest, Solnit suggests that inaction and caution may seem so much more rational than action unless you're in a burning building or on a sinking ship. But we might extend Solnit's point here by considering also how what seems rational is conditioned not only by where you are, but by who you are or who you imagine yourself to be. Divesting from fossil fuel stocks just might not compute to those whose identity, whose success is constructed around conducting economic business as usual. If you feel yourself to be the ship, what can abandoning it mean? During the Cold War, one extremist position was defined by the catchy motto, better dead than red. Actually, I've recently learned that this was a pithier reformulation of something that General Dwight Eisenhower himself first said, frighteningly, in 1950. He said, I'd rather be atomized than communized. During the climate crisis, a similar extremist logic underlies the moderate mainstream. Better dead than fundamentally disrupt fossil business as usual. So you'll have noticed that I persist in defining the climate crisis as rooted in that business as usual. In my second chapter, I try to address why that is. Here, I draw on an important strain of climate discourse, though one that has, of course, remained severely marginalized and, as Solnit's story illustrates, largely illegible. At those margins, one important study is Naomi Klein's, starkly titled, "This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate." In it, Klein roots the climate emergency in the premises of our economic system, especially its dependence on the fantasy of eternal and unlimited growth. Inflicting this fantasy on the real world has left us with no non-radical option. As Klein puts it, in our system of industrial capitalism, our economy is at war with the many forms of life on Earth, including human life. What the climate needs to avoid collapse is a contraction in humanity's use of resources. What our economic model demands to avoid collapse is unfettered expansion. Only one set of these rules can be changed, she points out, and she says, it's not the laws of nature. There's a lot more to say along those lines, of course, but as I develop that argument in the book, I point especially to an important work by Andreas Malm called Fossil Capital, The Rise of Steam Power and the Roots of Global Warming. This is the fullest account of the way modernity's utter reliance on fossil fuel resulted from the basic logic of capitalism itself. But in from those margins, the most prominent articulation of this understanding of the climate crisis was offered by Pope Francis in his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si. In that, the Pope focuses on the urgent threat to what he calls our planetary common home. He locates the threat in what he calls a certain way of understanding human life, which he sees as a culturally dominant technocratic paradigm. From that perspective, as he describes and decries it, reality, goodness, and truth automatically flow from technological and economic power as such. At the heart of this paradigm, he sees the idea of infinite or unlimited economic growth based on the lie that there is an infinite supply of Earth's goods. In this way, Francis locates the crisis precisely in the fabric of economic and ideological business as usual. When it first appeared, October 2015, I think October, for the most part, the Pope's encyclical was widely praised, but of course this praise was mainly lip service. Only a few months after it was issued, the power brokers of business as usual met in Paris, and to much self-congratulatory fanfare, they produced the celebrated Paris Agreement. But amidst all the fanfare, and despite its revered status in mainstream climate talk, the Paris Agreement utterly ignored the Pope's call for rethinking the premises of the technocratic paradigm. Paris could praise the Pope, but it couldn't process his meaning. Indeed, Amitav Ghosh has examined how enshrined at the core of the Paris Agreement's text is the current paradigm of perpetual growth. And as Ghosh suggests, this is exactly what one would expect from negotiations in which various billionaires, corporations, and climate entrepreneurs played an important part, and which drew on premises borrowed directly from the free trade agreements of the neoliberal era. At the center of the climate emergency, as the Pope sees it, is the technocratic paradigm. The Paris Agreement, Ghosh observes, banishes even the slightest acknowledgement that something has gone wrong with our dominant paradigms. As you all know, the Paris Agreement continues to be widely celebrated, at the very least as a step in the incrementalist step in the right direction. In this, the agreement offers a especially prominent example of the way our dominant discourses of the climate crisis disarticulate the dramatic challenge the crisis poses to business as usual. In my longest chapter, I examine a number of examples of this sort of rhetorical disarticulation. Of course, disarticulation is a strange term. In using it, I mean to evoke the violence inherent in the ways we talk and write about climate. And under these circumstances, I'd better confess right away that I stole that term from Jim Berger. In his book, as you heard, entitled The Disarticulate, Jim reminds us that disarticulation refers to, among other things, the separation of bones at the joint, as in butchery. In that sense, in suggesting that the constructions of climate change work to disarticulate its most troubling meanings, I mean to suggest that they amount to violent acts of rhetorical butchery. My book's third chapter is thus entitled Butcheries, and in it I survey a range of such violent discursive acts. I've already mentioned the Paris Agreement in this regard, and I'll try here to touch on a few other important examples. One crucial premise of the denialistic butchery that dominates the way we talk about climate is the way it frames the question of denial itself. This kind of normalized denial I'm talking about, that is, functions largely by locating the issue of climate change in relation to a simple binary. Is it real or isn't it real? In opposing the science-denying denialists who say no, or perhaps too soon to tell, so-called moderate voices can comfortably align themselves with, yes, it's real. They pose themselves as accepting reality. But this does not mean that they thus take the existential threat of that reality seriously enough to disrupt ecocidal business as usual. During the Trump years, the sport of blaming skeptics was more or less the only game in the climate town. Trump, bad. Not Trump, good, or at least okay. But such blaming has obscured that the commitment to ecocidal business as usual has been quite nonpartisan, a matter of political consensus. In this regard, consider the Obama administration's alarming dedication to fossil fuel. In what Noam Chomsky calls an eloquent death knell for our species, in 2012, Obama proudly reported this, and this is a quote, quoting him. Under my administration, America is producing more oil today than at any time in the last 8 years. This is a good thing, right? That's important to know. It is important to know, yes. Over the last 3 years, I've directed my administration to open up millions of acres for gas and oil exploration across 23 different states. We're opening up more than 75% of our potential oil resources offshore. We've quadrupled the number of operating rigs to a record high. We've added enough new oil and gas pipeline to encircle the earth and then some. That's Obama, who is, supposed to be a climate champion. And the jewel in Obama's climate crown was the 2015 Paris Agreement. I've already mentioned how that Paris Agreement amounts to a form of butchery, and I'll resist the temptation to elaborate the point, except maybe to add that its text contains not a single mention of the use of fossil fuels, not a single mention of oil or coal in the Paris Agreement. If the Paris Agreement stands as an especially prominent form of rhetorical butchery, a key moment in the historical emergence of such butchery was the 2006 appearance of Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. This film and book were crucial in ushering global warming into the wider public sphere. As they did this, they helped set and proliferate the basic terms by which climate change or global warming was understood. What were those terms? Well, far from introducing the climate crisis into the public sphere as a traumatic challenge to the logic of economic business as usual, Gore concludes his discussion of the relationship of the crisis to the economy with a fawning celebration of corporate power. He says, luckily, more and more US business executives are beginning to lead us in the right direction. And an example of such lucky leadership, he cites the head of GA, who says, we think green means green. This is a time period when environmental improvement is going to lead toward profitability. Luckily. Gore's economic boosterism here reflects the way his account of the climate crisis is deeply embedded in narratives of American triumphalism. Narratives constituted precisely by the disavowal of any traumatic disruption to American self-understandings. He thus contextualizes the climate crisis as the most recent of the sort of national challenges America has always risen to meet. What challenges are those? Gore provides this example. We made a moral decision that slavery was wrong, and that we could not be half free and half slave. The butchery here lies not only in his making the Civil War disappear, it lies also in his homogeneous American we, a we that excludes, who disarticulates, not only the hundreds of thousands of violent defenders of slavery, but also, of course, the millions of enslaved Americans themselves, who presumably wouldn't have needed a couple of hundred years to make a moral decision about whether or not slavery was wrong. Though it forgets the Civil War, an inconvenient truth as it contextualizes global warming, as it recounts why America can rise to the challenge. It does prominently feature World War II. As Gore sees it, victory there brought to his homogenized national we not only the moral authority and vision, but also the spiritual capacity and wisdom to lay the foundation for 50 years of peace and prosperity. Especially in a work urging that we face an inconvenient truth, this is a stupefyingly oblivious account of post-war history, an act of particularly bloody rhetorical butchery. This is true for all kinds of reasons, but what's most salient here is this: the 50 years founded by those morally authoritative and visionary leaders, those spiritually capable and wise leaders, was premised by design on the exponential increase in the burning of fossil fuels. Gore's time of peace and prosperity, that is, has in crucial ways produced the violence that is the climate crisis in the first place. As you know, for his landmark act of butchery, Gore was in 2007 awarded the Nobel Prize. And the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Committee has also honored the last act of prominent butchery that I'll mention here. In 2008, the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to William Nordhaus for his work on the economics of climate change. Thinking in cost-benefit terms, Nordhaus wondered, how much would the planet have to warm before the economic cost of mitigating the warming would, from an economic perspective, be worth it? In other words, what is the optimal amount of warming? The point at which the costs and benefits of mitigating climate change are balanced. Nordhaus calculated that the optimal amount of warming would be about 4 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial baseline. Now, you probably know or have heard that what climate science says is that anything over about 2 degrees probably poses a significant risk of utter catastrophe. And over the past 2 years, that 2-degree figure has in many contexts been revised downward to 1.5 degrees. Either way, 1.5 or 2, you'll notice that 4 degrees is higher. This particular piece of butchery might not be worth lingering over here, except for the fact that, again, it won the Nobel Prize. And last semester I tried to explain to one of my classes how Nordhaus had arrived at his conclusion that utter catastrophe is good for the economy. I drew here on the analysis of another economist, Steve Keen. I pointed out that Nordhaus proceeded by assuming that the economic activity that took place in carefully controlled environments will not be directly affected by climate change. This means that in his analysis, climate change would affect only industrial activity that takes place outside, not what takes place inside. So in the US, most of the economy would remain unaffected. As I was explaining this to the class, trying more or less to keep a straight face, one student started shaking his head incredulously and grinning broadly. When I finished, I asked him to comment, and he burst out laughing. But everything's outside. He laughed again. Buildings are outside. I'll let that stand as the final word in my discussion of the normalized denial built into the rhetorical butchery of business as usual. And I'll close this talk itself by reading just a bit from the book's coda, in which I consider a short narrative that as I read it, we might hear as trying to intervene against that butchery. This last bit takes just a few minutes. Someone once had a dream of a burning child calling out to his father. It makes its way to us through Freud, who introduces it at a critical point in the interpretation of dreams. Quoting Freud here, as he describes the dream. A father had been watching beside his child's sickbed for days and nights on end. After the child died, he went into the next room to lie down, but left the door open so that he could see his child's body laid out with tall candles surrounding it. After a few hours' sleep, the father had a dream that his child was standing beside his bed, caught him by the arm, and whispered to him reproachfully, "Father, don't you see I'm burning?" Over the century, this dream has provoked a lot of commentary, writers returning to it again and again. As the poet Amy Clampett writes of it in her poem called The Burning Child, the dream redacted cannot sleep. Clampett's poem itself reads the dream as a paradigm of grief. And as a paradigm of grief, for her, the child's cry emerges not only from whatever particulars were originally at stake, but more broadly from an entire century lurid with the recurrences of burning. But beyond grief itself, we might also hear in the child's cry a burning appeal. The child calls us, that is, not only to see and grieve what is already traumatically burnt and lost, but also to attend to what is in the very process of burning now and is not yet lost. It calls us to attend to what we might yet stop from burning. In this sense, at this moment, the dream of the burning child cries back a history whose traumas we are reproachfully called to witness. But the dream and the child's cry also reaches us from a future whose history is still at stake. We might imagine, that is, that in the child's cry, "Don't you see?" we can hear the future beseeching the present to interrupt an atrocity in progress. If we want to respond in kind to that desperate appeal, we will have to look beyond the denialist incrementalisms that constitute the common sense of our climate discourse. Is that possible? Is it possible that we might register in the dream child's cry not only the reproach of future generations for the contemporary failure to see, but also the burning appeal that might disrupt that failure? Is it possible that the child's cry might yet burn through the prevailing normalizations that have so benumbed our passive present? I don't know. But if it is, it will involve attending closely to that cry. In that spirit, I'll end this talk by letting the dream child get the last word. Father, don't you see I'm burning? That's it.
Okay. Professor Berger will now offer his response to Lee's talk, and then he will lead the Q&A session, please.
Okay. Yeah. Hi. I'm unmuted. Thanks, Adam. Thanks for your introduction, and it's good to be back at Hofstra. Although I'm not here. I'm not there. I'm still in my office, just looking at my computer. But it's good to see people who I haven't seen in a long time. Alice, good to see you. John, Karen, Craig, Julia, Tom, even a student, Ray. Hi. So anyway, and thank you, Lee, for this such an important and urgent book and allowing me to make a short response. So I'm going to try to be real short. I had written out some stuff, and now I'm going to try to just say a few other things which I didn't write. So that's going to be tough.
Wow,
but
wild,
basically,
you're wild.
I know. First, I think the central insight is kind of incontrovertible, that the largest danger to really think, that not only do we not seem to know what to do, we don't even seem to know how to say what to do or how to think what to do. And the problem seems to be not just these crazy climate skeptics. I mean, they're discredited, they're still there, they're still in the fossil fuel industry. But at this point, BP, it's beyond petroleum, right? Or GM has no fossil fuel cars after 2050. They've made that commitment. So the problem really is the kind of denial that Lee is talking about, which is that, yes, of course, we all understand what's going on with the climate. The facts are pretty clear, and therefore we must proceed with the utmost caution, because they're considering all these sort of economic considerations, and you have to have prepare people for new employment, and there's just all sorts of things which are hindering us from doing what we sort of think that we have to do. Why is this the case? And Lee's book sets out to try to come up with some reasons. What are we really talking about with this kind of liberal denialism? And in the one case, I think there are two psychoanalytic reasons that Lee goes with. The one is trauma, that the thinking about climate is akin to responding to some traumatic event, which is no longer fully representable, which kind of expresses itself through symptoms and behavioral aberrations and so on. And so some of our behavior does seem to be related to trauma. This, I'm perfectly, my tendency is that everything is pretty traumatic, and certainly stuff from the past is always going to have an effect. But in this case, as Lee points out, it's a different kind of thing. And other people have pointed this out too. I forget, whose ideas Lee is drawing from in this particular case. But in effect, it's a future trauma, which is a whole, something that we see approaching. And he refers to Timothy Morton in the hyper object, which is also a kind of a form of the sublime, some thing which is coming, which is larger than we can just get our conceptual grip around. And so it has an effect on representation, which is akin to the effect of trauma. It's like the planet in the great film Melancholia. The planet is coming, it's going to hit us. And there it is. So yes, okay, trauma, we can, and that I think needs to be talked about a great deal more, because I'm not sure it actually works. I'm not sure the concept of future trauma actually is a thing, but it's something like that. Certainly there's something we can't get our heads around with this, although at the same time the facts are perfectly known. There they are. No, we know what the situation is. It's just that we don't seem to be able to do anything about it. And so for that reason, I think Lee's second reason that we can't talk about it properly is the concept of denial, and that I think is a very astute observation. And this is denial in more of a psychoanalytic sense, denial as opposed to, say, repression. And if there's something which is really, really unpleasant and really disturbing and really just you don't want to deal with it for one reason or another, in Freud's terms, well, oftentimes it gets repressed, gets sent down into some unconscious place, and you really and truly don't know it's there, but it expresses itself symptomatically in terms of behavior, in terms of repetitions, in terms of this, that, and the other. So it's repressed. But in another case, oh no, you know perfectly well what the trouble is, and you can talk about it. It's not bothering you. The only problem is you seem unwilling, one is unwilling or unable to acknowledge the actual consequences and effects of this troubling thing. And so it's denial, it's sort of an acceptance on an intellectual level, but some kind of deeper refusal to actually take some action and deal with it. And I think that does seem to be kind of where we are. And so this continual reliance on the conventional wisdom, on the way that things go, on what one needs to do. And that does seem to be kind of where we are. And so, yes, the child is burning, or the child is going to be eaten, which is a new word for me. What's it called? Pedophagia. Pedophagia, and I looked this up in a cookbook, and
Oh no!
I found it right.
Explain what it is, Jim.
It was under Jonathan Swift. It was in that reading. Oh, well, pedo referring to child, phagia referring to diet, to eating. So eating the child, which is sort of what we are doing with our future. Okay,
I write about that in one of my chapters, which I didn't talk about.
Right. So a couple of questions. I guess the first obvious question, which I know all of us are going to ask, and so I will preempt it, is, so what do you think of the Biden infrastructure plan, which does give, billions of dollars too. I mean, I even wrote it down, a few things, in electric vehicles, 174 billion, public transit, 85 billion, railways, 80 billion, disaster resilience, 50 billion, electric grid, 100 billion. So a lot of billions. So it does seem, vastly more resources being devoted to fighting climate change than ever, than anyone, whether it'll even happen, of course, is another story, but it seems like at least something in a level of seriousness that we haven't seen. And yet, is it the good not being the sufficient in this case? Is it simply another case of that? And the second question I have, and you had asked as we were chatting before, you had said that you had sort of not really discussed the literature parts of your book, because maybe people just haven't read the books you're going to talk about or whatever. But one of the things you point out or argue in the literature chapters is the need for some kind of formal dislocating, sort of a formal disarticulation in literary work, which somehow will evoke more vividly and truly the kind of dislocated situation that we in fact find ourselves in. So there would be a synecdotal or whatever relationship between literary form and actual climate reality. And I wonder whether, I'm not sure I agree with that. Is the only way to, is to get to the reality of this to write like Beckett or like, Maus, or like our favorite novel, Ridley Walker, something which is going to just sort of jam the synapses of the reader's head. You don't write like that. Why would that stricture apply to fiction, to criticism, when to literature, when it does not apply to sort of what us guys do as literary scholars and critics? Would it not, if it's good for one, why not for the other? And is it indeed not possible to write in a more sort of expository or a generic style? You're very down on sort of generic science fiction, and most of it does fail, I think. But at the same time, if you can get the idea there, I don't know. I'm just thinking of the latest Kim Stanley Robinson, The Ministry for the Future, in which he actually posits a UN organization whose stakeholders are the future. It's entrusted to represent the interests of the future, and it does so in some actually kind of interesting ways for those of you, including terrorism, just to shake up that conventional wisdom. So anyway, those are two questions. One, what about the Biden infrastructure plan, and a little more on the necessity for formal sort of modernist whatever literary style. And otherwise, thanks so much, Lee, and it's a pleasure always to hear your voice and see you.
Thanks, Jim. So for the first question, in terms of Biden's plan, it's the good, not the sufficient. I've written about Biden's climate plan that he put out when he was running for president, and there's an article in magazine called Current Affairs, in which I looked closely at the plan that he was proposing. The title of that article is called "When the Good is the Enemy of the Sufficient." Unless you can show how what he's proposing, in fact, is designed to lower emissions drastically enough to meet the IPCC deadline of zero emissions by 2050, and 50% by 2030. That's not what his goals are. And even if they are what his goals are, do these reach those goals? The thing I look at when I look at these plans is they love to talk about money for renewable energy. They love that. The problem is that the directly relevant thing is, do they curtail fossil fuel burning? You can add as much renewable energy as you want, but that doesn't mean yet automatically that you're limiting fossil fuel burning. Historically, when a new energy source becomes available, it doesn't replace an existing energy source. People use more energy. That's what's happened historically. So renewables are obviously going to be crucial, but only if they're paired with a drastic reduction of fossil fuel burning. And that's not what Biden's initial plan has called for. That's not what he's calling for now. I don't know how much to go on about this, because I could. Just say one thing. I guess one example. He's praised for not issuing any more federal permits to do fossil fuel mining on federal lands. Great. But that doesn't stop what's going on now, nor does it the mining that's going on now, nor does it stop the mining that it's still allowed from the existing permit. So it doesn't really stop burning fossil fuel. And if anyone has any more questions about that, I can certainly elaborate on the inadequacy of that plan. But I don't want to monopolize. The second question you asked about is writing Beckett or Ridley Walker, or I see Peter here, Peter's book, which I write about George Anderson. Is writing one of these nonlinear, crazy-ass kind of narratives the only way? Who am I to say? It's one way that I think is possible. Language which denormalizes in some way or another, as I can see it, is a way of representing what is beyond the normal. Is it the only way? I don't know. The stuff that I write or you write, I don't know. I'm just,
For us guys, of course, there are strictures of publishing. If one wrote a completely anti-generic academic book, what academic press would want it unless, right. Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, so, but.
And that's part of well, okay. So I don't claim to have a monopoly on what kind of representations might work. I've written in my book an analysis of some of the ones that I think are models, and those are models which address the difficulty itself, which stage what I call the representational impasse itself. And by staging that impasse, they point beyond it. And, you know, I talk about Ridley Walker, I talk about The Road, I talk about Peter's book, George Anderson. You mentioned Kim Stanley Robinson, and there I'll take you on more directly. I write about Robinson in my book, and I don't understand how Robinson is taken seriously as a climate writer. I've read his trilogy called Science in the Capital, and it was renamed Green Earth. And the payoff, the good thing that happens is that the government and industry get together and dump 500 million tons of salt in the North Atlantic to stop the, to make sure the Gulf Stream doesn't stop. In other words, that book is invested in geoengineering, which is not, which is sort of an intensification of business as usual. So anyway, Kim Stanley Robinson is not someone who I understand as writing about trauma in its, writing about global warming in its traumatic roots.
We will talk, you and I will talk privately. That'll be our private chat. But there's a couple of people who are asking questions. Jose, and then someone else in the chat who had something. Tom Ross. So as Jose can unmute, I don't know who Jose is, but if he's present and wants to ask his question.
Jose, you there?
Oh, yeah, unmute.
Yes, I'm here. I thought somebody would just read my rather long-winded question.
No, I'm not going to do that.
I put it in the chat, so now I'm going to have to look up the chat and say what I have to say. Okay, sorry for this. You make a convincing case for why incremental change is insufficient to confront the looming disaster, and yet incremental change is the only even remotely realistic possibility given the world, the politics, the rules on how Congress can pass a law, the sheer number of people who, despite obvious evidence, ignore or worse, vehemently deny the obvious. This was really driven home to me, now during COVID, 500,000 people or more have died. And still, there's a sizable part of this country that doesn't give a shit, that deny it, ignore it. Who knows? I don't even know how they think.
Right.
And I'm just referring to the United States. And you multiply this by this politics and situations of however many other countries you want. Maybe you want just the industrialized ones, but that adds up to. It doesn't look good. The numbers don't look good. So I guess my question is finally, how would you suggest we, in quotes, proceed? And by we, you can use whatever meaning of we you wanna use.
Okay, right. Oh, I'm sorry. Our time is up. Shall we continue next time? No. You called incrementalism the only realistic option.
I'm not even sure about that, but yes, I'll mute now. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. It depends what you mean by realistic. Incrementalism denies scientific reality. I see incrementalism as, who gets to define what, you're talking about politically realistic, but what realism means politically and what it means in terms of geophysically are two different things. How can radical change happen fast? I don't know. I just know that you can't predict what humans do the way you can predict what physics does. People like Tom Ross will be better at speaking about activism than I will. But I would question the idea that incrementalism is realistic. In terms of what we should do, you tell me. I mean, I don't know that I have, I'm not sure I can, I'm not sure I know. Obviously, something like activism, to what degree do is that up to me to say? I don't know. I don't claim to be giving good advice about how to achieve radical sufficient change. I can only say that that's what reality demands, and that is it possible? Maybe. Do I know how it's possible? That's not my bailiwick, and I don't know.
Yeah, I'll just chime in very briefly and say I'm rather convinced that it's not possible.
Well, I'm not convinced it is or isn't possible. That's not people ask me, are you hopeful or you're not hopeful? How I feel is not to the point, or, I'm not predicting the future. I'm just saying this is what has to be. This is what has to be done if it can be. We've had this discussion. Okay.
All right. Yeah. I think Tom Ross, do you want to elaborate what you were saying in the chat, or whatever question you have or comment?
Lee, please excuse the fact that I was a little bit late, but I've been reading and rereading your book for a couple of years now. So, and I'm very happy to be here, and congratulations for all the wonderful attention that you've been receiving. The comment I made in the chat was actually just to second your observation about some of the insufficiencies that pertain to Biden's proposals, which are very much in line with proposals that have been being developed in response to scientific findings since the early 90s, especially coming out of the neoliberal left camp of governance, global governance. And what I was mentioning specifically was the BECCS, bioenergetic carbon capture and storage technologies, which the Biden administration is heavily investing in through, no surprise, predecessor technocrats that he has inherited in terms of influence, although they don't appear in org structures in his diagrams of membership, of people that were working in the Obama administration on the same thing. Ernest Moniz, the physicist, who's a big proponent of the same, and Arjun Majumdar at Stanford. One of the problems with a lot of these technocratic solutions, as you point out quite amply in numerous places in your writing, is that capital and its resources are engaged in a procedure that's fraught with significant risk of failure or insufficiency. And at the end of the day, when you do the game theory and you figure out who wins, actually the only ones who are certain to win are those who are developing these technologies, who will incur and gain the subsidies of the state and the taxpayers for developing technologies which it isn't likely have been shown in any instance. For instance, the massive planting of stands of native locust trees to absorb carbon, and then they're burned and everything else. I don't know how familiar people are with the intricacies of these technologies, but it doesn't really matter. I think there's ample stuff if everyone wants to look out there to see that there's all kinds of raging questions about how effective they can be and how they might be able to be developed at scale. Unfortunately, the same holds true for renewable sources in a much less devastatingly critical way. But so just wanted to second that. But to get to the point of where I was going, Lee, and I want to ask you this in a way as something that we've often discussed in terms of radical notions and radical theories of change. Suppose we think of denial as being a species of a type of collective response to an existing condition that has many precedents. So, for example, we think of the current system that we exist under, particularly since the fall of the Berlin Wall. The triumph of the end of history, capitalism as we know it, striding triumphantly into the future, has many dark, foreboding aspects and downsides that are hardly ever addressed. One of them being the fact that it seems like even in this current regime, to get back to the environmental question, it's the same old playbook that capital accumulation has always proposed in the name of liberalist individual, holding up individual liberties in the spirit of liberalism. It effects massive harms. For instance, right now, at this second, there are hundreds of thousands of people in mostly Black, Brown, and Indigenous people throughout the world suffering the direct consequences of the warming that's already happened. Massive displacement, huge demographic problems, huge problems with disease, triggering conditions of political instability, like what's happening in the Niger region in Western Africa, where drought conditions directly attributable to global warming have given rise to political instabilities, which have led to conflicts, which literally taken the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Not to mention the destruction of economies and other kinds of things, and exacerbating existing conditions of public health crises and other things like that. There's a study which was done very recently, which estimated the GDP impacts of warming. It's something that I wish people like William Nordhaus would take to the bank and study as assiduously as they seem to study the things that they scrawl across their blackboards. For example, it's estimated that the GDP impact of warming to 3C by 2100 will create GDP impacts comparable to either that of the 2008 GFC on the United States or the COVID impact on the world for any one of 40 or 50 developing countries. But isn't it interesting that those developing countries comprise about 75% of the world's population? So what we're talking about here is inaction that actually amounts to acknowledging or a denial, which is a denial about a set of differential impacts, which involve the same kinds of divisions, going back to my idea of a continuity from the past. Although, James, I think your point about future trauma and the way that trauma is usually construed in psychoanalytic sense is coming from a past, a sense of past. This is a very interesting point to wrestle with and to sharpen things on. Thank you for that. But in the sense of a continuity of a past state going into the present, the continuity is right there. All the development of the Western world happening at the expense of the rest of the world. So when I think of the denial that is involved in climate denial, I think of a denial that's very similar to the denial that that renders the systems that we live under, the liberal individualist systems that we live under, of being constitutionally or genomically incapable of being compatible with any form or strategies whatsoever of producing any kind of reparative, redistributive justice. So when you look at the ideas that are presented in the UN and large bodies of government about what is said about decoupling emissions from material growth, decoupling material consumption from growth, a lot of those ideas that are actually presented as legitimate turn out to be full of holes and pretty much able to be debunked. So what happens is that it comes down to this, that as Jose was saying, and I share his skepticism, I share the bitterness of his skepticism, I share the pessimism of the intellect that's inherent in his skepticism, that's for sure. Because what seems to be required is a backing away from the same kind of ideas of growth that we've entertained so far. When someone writes a very convincing argument that growth itself must be constrained to limits less than 1 or 2% a year, that means the kinds of growth that we've been experiencing the last 30 years have to be drastically curtailed. But then the sort of comforting optimism of the will part of that comes out in, well, what is that growth actually been? That growth has been the proliferation of casino-like engineered financial gain that has had very little impact on the overwhelming majority of the rest of the population. So my question to you, Lee, is what do you see as the relationship between the ideas of the denial, the sources of denial, and its continuity with past historical circumstances where there's been an absence of political will for fundamental, redistributive, reparative political change?
Thank you, Tom. If I understand the question, I think you're, I think I'm going to read I'm going to suggest, this has been written about, that the idea that to confront the trauma of climate change as a trauma of, Western capitalism is to confront the traumatic history of that structure. So that this is why I brought in Al Gore, who introduces climate not as growing out of the same cultural logic that produces slavery and that produced the Vietnam War and all the other stuff he doesn't talk about. But rather he presents it as an opportunity to, show how we're great. His representation, so the point is that, as Donna Orange writes about, not until we can confront the trauma of that history, or in confronting the trauma of climate would involve also confronting the trauma of that history. That the atrocity in process is of a piece with the history of normalized atrocity. And that's why I brought in Gore, because I think that's a crucial moment when climate is segregated from the larger cultural logic. Thanks.
Yeah, boy, thank you very much, both of you guys. Let's see, John DiCarlo, if he's still around, he's absent from his yellow box.
I think Ray had a question, Jim.
Yeah, okay, terrific. Ray, unmute.
I feel like I'm back in college. Talk about trauma. Good to see everyone. So my question for Lee is, so I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan right now, and I'm looking at the 2-page flyer about what climate change means for Michigan. And let me see quickly, it says the climate is changing and temperatures are increasing. Greenhouse gases are changing the world's ocean and ice cover. So ice is going to melt in Michigan, which is going to increase flooding. According to the flyer, nobody knows what this is going to do to the Great Lakes. Birds and fish are going to die. Forests will change. Air pollution and heat stroke will be problems. Oh, and then the one advantage is, let me see if I can get this, that shipping will increase by 8 days. And then it ends with certain people are especially vulnerable, including children, the elderly, the sick, and the poor. This flyer is written by the Environmental Protection Agency. I guess to sort of capture your writing in some sense, rather than saying we're really fucked, can I just like invoke the language of my generation and say, what the fuck? How do we deal with that? Because that comes out of Richard Nixon's Environmental Protection Agency.
Is the question, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, in the sense of like the cost benefit analysis, I see a lot of costs, and apparently the benefit is 8 days of increased shipping.
Well, it's absurd to begin with. I mean, I don't even know how to, you know, I mean, Ray, as you point out, you know, there's all kinds of work that shows as the ice melts in the Arctic, that's good because it'll open up more possibilities for oil exploration under the ocean, and it'll help shipping. It's an economic good. I mean, Hillary Clinton talked about that. So I mean, that's just part of the butchery that is the coin of the realm when government talks about this stuff. When I say butchery is a coin of the realm, can I say that? Is that, or will the I think the metaphor police may have to. Okay.
It's a bit. It's another bit. It's another bit currency. It's atrocity
Okay.
coin.
Okay. All right. Fine.
Let's see. I think John, DeCarlo, you had put something in the chat about an epoch ago, but you want to pursue it?
Yeah, we're I don't know. We're exploring such a strange eschatology. It's hard to, as you said, it's hard to think and speak about this. I'm just going to play, kind of do it like a Zen slap. Well, let me preface this. You know, as Neil Young has said, you know, it was not, the music did nothing. The Cultural Revolution did nothing. It was only when enough body bags came back from the Vietnam War back to middle America that there was pressure put on Johnson, and that might be a very sobering reality that pertains to this situation as well. I'm just, you know, I think we have to be careful with reductionism. Physicists resist this, but there's good arguments now with, we're beyond post-Darwin here, or even a neo-Darwinism. We're in a epigenetic emergent reality that applies, but not only to the biological, but to the cultural. So I think we who approach this more rationally, if you will, we have to be careful. how we frame the science, and I think it's more complex than it might even rethink it is, which isn't a very comforting thing, but it's a reality. And then people have been saying that capitalism is non-sustainable, but it's like cancer. It appropriates, it co-ops everything, and it survives. And that's a reality. It's a hardcore reality. So I have no salvation here. But like I said, I think we have to be very sober in terms of our understanding of economic systems, cultural systems, and biological systems. There's some hope. Last time I was at the Museum of Natural History, birds who've been around almost as long as the dinosaurs, in their own lifetime, it's not what they pass off to their offspring. They through epigenetics, they reselect genes to immune themselves from toxicity in some cases. Right, so it's a wild, strange world. Just leave it with this image. A physicist tells me a complex system is when you have 10,000 grains of rice in a bottle. One of them is the color red. And you open and you pour those 10,000 grains, and you do that so many times you can start to be able to predict when the red grain of rice will appear in the same place. You'll get a pattern. That's a complex system. We're beyond complex systems. We cannot explain and we cannot predict what's going to happen biologically and culturally. That's Stuart Kaufman talks about this well, extending Gould, who differed with Morris about evolution and ecological change. So I hate to say, I think where it's even more complex and weird and strange than the scientists can really even get their arms around. And I don't know what that means. But like kind of a Zen slap, just and then that sober reality. The water at the base of Manhattan, I think it's half an inch above sea level now, right? They've been talking about bringing the Dutch in here to build dams, right? As Ray was saying, I think there's going to have to be an existential crisis, and as Tom said, there already is one globally, but it hasn't hit middle America in a sense, and that's, I don't know, that's my 2 cents. So I can't even pose a question. Sorry.
I was just remembering Bill McGibbon's recent book, Falter, in which after most of the book laying out pretty much the kind of scenario that Lee is laying out, basically it's like George Clooney and his friends in the burning barn in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? The police are outside, they're in the barn, it's burning. He says, boys, we're in a tight spot.
Tight spot here.
So that's where we are. But the two things that he feels are hopeful are, one, solar technology. There's a lot of sunlight, there's getting more. Just lay the damn things out everywhere and see what you get, and stop pumping oil. Just stop. And the second, in order to get to that point, I guess, is what he calls, I think a little cryptically, full spectrum social movements. It sounds so intriguing. Full spectrum social movements.
Wow.
So I take that to mean not just, oh, well, here's the Black Lives Matter, and here's the environmentalists, and here's the tax reform, and here's the, whatever. But it's all, the struggle at this point is one struggle, the struggle for social justice, racial, economic justice, and the struggle to save the biosphere. It's the same thing. And it's not a
James,
question.
I think the operative term that we hear nowadays is intersectional.
I think exactly, and I think that's exactly where I don't know where Bill McGibbon talks, but to me, it's not an intersection anymore. Intersections are for roads and lines, it's one struggle. It's not an intersection, I'll go to your rally if you go to my rally. It's like we're in the same,
To that point, I love that, James. So something radically emergent can occur culturally, globally. That's just another one of the possibilities that we can't explain or predict, but it's possible.
Yeah, anybody? Yeah, so let's open this up at this point. Mark, were you raising your hand? And then John Bryant?
Yeah, I'm not from here. I'm from Russia and Europe, kind of live both, yeah. And I've heard here an idea that, yeah, he's my professor. I'm in class with Professor. Sorry, I just lost my thought. Yeah, I've heard that the idea that globalization can be good if it's right people, if it's like this, it's specific, if it's controlled, if it's kind of like, I can say like, if everybody, like, let's just assume everybody is like, moving in here, like all the criminals, all the like terrorists, this is not going to be a good globalization then. So we can be as good as bad, if it makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. John, Brian.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks, Lee. That was a great presentation, and I think some of the comments that I've been hearing from Tom and from John and you, Jim, are tending toward a kind of concern that I was thinking of, and that is, trauma is the right word to use, but my God, how many are there? Do there have to be? I mean, to really see that the problem is that how do democratic institutions, however they are constructed by history and the absurdities of history, how do they address trauma when often trauma has already been happening for 100 years, or in the case of this country for 400 years, and that it is, it's not, as people I think have been saying, a number of different separate traumas, but really one ball of shit. And I think part of the problem about denial is that it's so easy to do in American structured democracy and the way it's been structured, and clearly specifically structured to make political action and radical political action happen. And for some cases, that's not a bad thing, because you don't want a mob to be taking over. On the other hand, we have a Senate that seems to be constructed so that nothing can really be addressed, and a Senate that is based on racist assumptions about how the country should develop and move along. So the trauma is with the denial. I mean, denial itself is the compounding trauma, because our system is designed to feed it, allow it, never address it. And you just find this kind of frustration that I think all of us are feeling, and that you said, well, Jim, you were saying, let's get the cat out of the bag. What do you think of Biden's plan? And clearly, it's not sufficient, to use Lee's terms. I think it's a very valuable book, because it just gives you the vocabulary that we need in order to begin to address it. I don't know that there's a kind of solution for immediate activism. I would want to first get rid of the Senate. I'd want to get rid of the Electoral College. I would want to get rid of a lot of stuff that are just, not just roadblocks, but a whole way of thinking that never should have been to begin with, but has been continuing on for forever. And but I think most compelling, I mean, the presentation, Lee, was compelling from beginning to end. And ending with the dream was very moving. But I think I kind of was reading it as you were explicating it. I was sort of reading it as a dream about denial. The dream of the burning child is not about the child; it's about the dreamer, and that moment of awakening out of his denial. You know, the kid is saying, "Why are you letting me burn?" When the parent is just waking up to the reality of his stewardship, and what an incredible story, myth, dream, because it really just kind of nails it. When what we're talking about is waking up, and I know that's you know, such an obvious thing to say, but that's the only way that it can happen. As Melville said, I think it's Herman Melville. There's this shock of recognition that's involved, and when will these shocks of recognition finally become translated into it? I want to get to those chapters, Lee, about the literature and how it can do. I mean, you know, one of the cheesiest, most tedious books in 19th century American literature is Uncle Tom's Cabin, which probably did actually have impact on readers toward activism, as opposed to the book that was published the year before, Moby Dick, which really was one of these radical kinds of writing that nobody read. They didn't get it, even though it was talking about the apocalyptic, the apocalypse that America was heading toward, and not just racially, but also in terms of species, because of eradications of species that we're witnessing, not just whales, but buffalo and so on and so forth. What can literature do? I know you, Lee, you were, that question was put to you, but I wanted to focus it again on how can a good piece of writing work to undo and unlearn the stereotypes of our democracy and our institutions, and really be a kind of shock of recognition for readers. That was a question.
Okay.
It also, Lee, yeah, answer that question, but then I think Michaela, you have a question to follow. Is that right?
Yeah, it actually dovetails really nicely with John's question.
Oh, then
please,
why don't you ask it and we can do them together.
Okay, great. So my question, you know, as I mentioned, I think it relates to John's question, and it really goes to the de-articulation and how that amounts to a further butchery of you know, the problem as we understand it. I was curious on both Lee and Jim's thoughts on, you know, starting from the bottom, how do we begin in a type of activism that shifts the thoughts of other people? I think that, you know, us in this forum having this conversation, we are, you know, we've delved into this issue, and I think a lot of us probably have, you know, people close in our lives who have not. And so not only how does the literature create that shock of reality, but how can we, as, you know, how can we be activists in our daily lives of shifting the language and how we talk about it to further, you know, other people's awakening to the reality?
I would say that's a great dovetail to what I was trying to get at.
Oh, right. They both, yeah. How do you get into people's heads, Lee? And to get them into their heads together. not just individuals.
Well, I think what Michaela was getting at is how do you get them to change the vocabulary? How do you get them to change the language? Because so much of, well, I mean, there's a rhetoric of denial, and that's exactly what Lee is addressing, and part of his book.
This is a question I'd like to hear other people talk about, since I'm not sure I'm much of an expert on it. In fact, I think many of my friends who are here might point out that I've been not especially good at talking about it. I have sometimes felt a little bit like the ancient mariner. You recall people are going to the wedding and he just intervenes apropos of nothing. There was a ship. What? Unhand me, gray-bearded loon, and he just, and then all the ancient mariner can go around and, just intervene with the business as usual of the wedding. I like a wedding feast as much as the next guy, but there have been times when I have learned that I have to shut up a lot, and I don't know. Maybe some of you have better thoughts than I do about this. I tried to write this book as a way of intervening. Peter keeps trying to get me to write a different kind of book next. So maybe he can comment, I don't know. But the question of how to intervene in that language, I mean, I try to do it in my teaching and my other kind of writing, I'm sure we all do. That might not be such a great answer. And I think probably, I'm curious what others might think about that, since it's a kind of the question.
Peter, you look like you're on the verge of saying something, so spill it.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Lee, I just wanted to thank you. Lee, I was incredibly inspired by, I've heard you for years now, and your presentation, it seemed to me you'd gone to a new place of making it available for kind of internal transformation. I mean, I think you've done an amazing thing tonight. I mean, it's for me. And I just wanted to say one thing, which is, the more, my life was trying to be a writer, and suddenly, finally, in my age, I become a writer. And my realization is that, in all my years in publishing, the realization is that it's not books that matter, but it's reading and it's language. And I think maybe McKibben is right, that as we're so invested in the book or in literature, that maybe literature can get us to a point where we reinvest in language and wait for something emergent. And I know it's despair isn't, my conclusion is that despair is the alternative available to denial, and it's a much better place to be, and it's not a negative place. It doesn't have to be a negative place, and it's the American triumphalism, and it's our investment in literature, and part of that, and that this language has potentials that we haven't really, that's emergent, that we can't imagine from where we are, but that doesn't mean there are not possibilities there in language itself, and to invest ourselves in language and not in publishing, not in books, but maybe in reading, but reading as thought, not as a profession or as a civilizational accomplishment. There may be something else there that will come, if not from us, from somewhere else. That's all. That's my only utopian kind of gesture I can make.
My sense is that it's really hard work, and it's something people do individually, but somehow I think doing things with other people, just making sure one is doing things with other people, and preferably people who are unlike oneself, from different backgrounds, races, whatever, but those spaces are, weirdly enough, or not so weird, I suppose, in this country, they're not that easy to find. Like labor unions sometimes are like that. There are some social movements which are genuinely multi-class, cross-class, cross-race, and if you can find one, then, you know, get in it and work. But the trouble is working with other people. The trouble with working with other people is that you're working with other people. and that is always very, very trying.
Oh, they're the worst. Yeah.
Well, there you go. So, you know, no, I don't know. Michaela, what is your sense?
Yeah, I agree. I wanted to add that part of my question also, I think it went to Lee, you mentioned in the book, and I think it's Donna Haraway's defeatist discourse, and trying to kind of manage that fear of talking about it in a way that doesn't, you know, scare people, or kind of, Lee, what you were talking about with the Ancient Mariner of like, you know, here it is, just look at it. And it's disheartening to me that, you know, it takes changing the conversation and easing people into it. And a brief anecdote, this came up in a work situation where for Women's National History Month, I wanted to lead an intersectional weekly communication for each affinity group. And I wanted to organize it in a way that showed the representation of that affinity group in the industry, followed by a trailblazer, followed by an issue important to that affinity group, followed by resources of how to be an ally. And in getting approval on this communication, I got pushback to reorganize it in a way that was more affirmative, to put the trailblazer story first and the statistics of the representation, particularly of women in the industry, second, because people don't want to read a depressing email because it will make them feel that despite their best efforts, that change isn't happening fast enough. And as that is my superior, I can only push back so much, which I did, but to no avail. It makes me question, and I guess this is my addition to this feedback on this question, is how much do we kind of restrain ourselves to ease people in, to continue comforting the people who don't see the big picture, in the hopes that they will awaken and have that shock to reality, and that maybe it's like little steps that will get us there, as opposed to kind of a shock at the outset.
Yeah, anyone else? Any other thoughts? I don't know, what is our time situation? Do you know how long they booked the hall?
I think the lunatics have taken over the asylum here. I think we're on our own.
Oh, there's Ethelene says we should begin wrapping up.
Yeah, I have it scheduled for 8:30. I don't know if that's me, but
that's I think that's more than enough.
I have a swift and modest proposal to offend all the able-bodied white men on the video chat. Somewhere between like eating the child and eating the poor and eating the elderly, can we just like get rid of able-bodied white men and see what happens?
Right, as long as no one mistakes me for able-bodied, I'm good.
Strikes me as a little bit reductive, actually.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I mean,
but humorous.
In the right spirit. Lee, any final thoughts from you on and I suppose, I guess one last thing. Okay, we have this Biden proposal. It's not good enough. We have to obviously urge our elected representatives to pass the goddamn thing, no matter what it takes, and then turn up the energy. That's, a victory is only the beginning of a fight.
Yes.
Right. We have to be careful about talking about the beginnings of things. You know, part of the vexing thing is the time. It's an emergency. And I guess that's the argument about incrementalism. Yogi Berra said, it gets late early these days. He's reputed to have said it gets late early these days. I like your remark, Jim, about doing things with other people. I think, and Peter, your remark about it's how we read. The interactivity of that is at the center of things. If I could go back to Pavel in The Mouse, when he said, what's the point of having any more books? And Artie, who she's talking to, says, yeah, Samuel Beckett once said, every word is like an unnecessary stain on silence. And Pavel says, yes. And then there's a quiet frame in the book where there's no talking. And it's important to me that when Pavel says yes, what he means is yes and no. Since yes, every word is like a not unnecessary stain on silence. But he says yes. And in that saying yes, he can acknowledge and share what Artie is experiencing. And there's a shared sense of the impasse. And in that sharing, at least in this book, in that sharing, they go on. And in my book, one of the things I write about with the literature is that scene of extended listening. So one of the things we can do, I guess, is listen. Listen to the burning child, listen to each other, try to bear what we hear. That isn't a very practical remark, perhaps, but it's the kind of thing that I think about. Jim, thanks for wrangling all this stuff.
Yeah, I really appreciate your asking me to do this, and thank you for the really rigorous argument and helping us have this conversation. And thanks to all you guys who came. And it was
really
appreciate
everybody who's here. It's really, really heartening. Thank you.